Welcome, dear listener, to another tale woven with mystery, thriller, and suspense. A story that promises to intrigue and captivate. My dear listeners from the United Kingdom, Canada, not forgetting New Zealand, Australia, Belgium, and, of course, United States, and all around the world, thank you ever so much for your wonderful support. Your loyalty is as essential as a key clue in a mystery. Now, let us begin. The mystery awaits. Shall we begin? The Bluebird Tea Room in St. Mary Mead was a cramped little nest where the village's secrets fluttered about as freely as the steam from its teapots. On a crisp autumn afternoon, the place buzzed with the low hum of idle chatter, the air thick with the scent of brewed tea and fresh scones. Nestled at a small table by the window, Miss Jane Marple and her long-time friend, Mrs. Hartnell, were steeped in observation. Mrs. Hartnell leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You've heard about the Whittaker boy, haven't you?" she asked, stirring her tea more vigorously than necessary. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Charles Whittaker, yes. I hear he's planning something big for the weekend. An engagement party, isn't it?" "That's the word," Mrs. Hartnell confirmed, casting a glance over her shoulder. "He's set his sights on Lillian Everett. Bright girl, that one. Too bright for her own good, some say." Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the room, where the village folk murmured over their cups. "And not everyone seems delighted by the news," she observed softly, her voice barely rising above the clink of porcelain. "Indeed," Mrs. Hartnell huffed, leaning back. "Charles hasn't exactly been discreet about his troubles either. Mark my words, Jane, there's trouble brewing there. A man in debt is a man desperate." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her face a mask of serene contemplation. "Desperation often leads to poor choices, Mary," she remarked. "And poor choices make for good gossip, but troubling outcomes." From the adjacent table a snippet of conversation caught her attention. "And with the Whittaker estate on the line, who wouldn't be tempted to step out of bounds?" a woman said to her companion, her voice laced with a blend of concern and schadenfreude. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind piecing together the fragments of information as seamlessly as she knitted her scarves. St. Mary Mead, with its quaint facades and flower-laden lanes, might look peaceful to the unsuspecting eye, but beneath its charming exterior it was a breeding ground for secrets, and not all of them as petty as they seemed. The detective in her recognized the undercurrents of unease that such financial instability could cause in a small community where everyone knew each other's business. Charles Whittaker's engagement, ostensibly a celebration, could just as easily be a facade for more sinister machinations. Mrs. Hartnell, catching the slight furrow in Miss Marple's brow, leaned in closer. "What is it, Jane? You look as though you've just solved the case before it's even been opened." Miss Marple smiled, her expression light but her eyes sharp. "Just thinking aloud, my dear. We live in a village where the whispers carry more truth than the town crier. Best we keep our ears open and our minds alert." As the chatter continued around them, the air in the Bluebird Tea Room seemed to thicken with intrigue. Miss Marple continued to listen, her mind already sifting through the layers of social pleasantries for the grains of truth hidden beneath. In St. Mary Mead every whispered scandal was a thread, and Miss Marple was just the one to pull it. Whittaker Manor stood like a proud but weary sentinel on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, its grand Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the small, cosy cottages that dotted the rest of the village. Today its usual solemnity was undercut by a flurry of activity, servants scurrying about with the kind of urgency that only impending social gatherings of importance could provoke. Charles Whittaker, heir to the manor and the centre of the local gossip mill, moved through the chaos with a clipboard in hand, his face etched with lines of concentration and worry. Every now and then he'd stop to adjust a decoration or redirect a lost-looking caterer, his actions betraying a nervous energy that didn't quite fit the poised facade he was struggling to maintain. Margaret Whittaker, his older sister, watched him with a critical eye from the doorway of the grand drawing-room. "Do you need to be quite so lavish, Charles?" she called out, her voice carrying over the noise. "This looks more like a coronation than an engagement party. Remember, the Whittaker coffers aren't what they used to be." Charles offered her a tight smile, a flash of annoyance crossing his features, before he managed to school his expression into one of mock reassurance. "It's under control, Margaret. We need this to be perfect." Lillian Everett, the soon-to-be fiancée, arrived shortly thereafter, her presence like a calm amid the storm. She was grace personified, each step measured, her eyes scanning the room not just to admire but to assess. As she approached Charles, there was a practised ease to her smile, but the tension in her jaw suggested she was well aware of the whispers that swirled around her union with Charles. Their conversation was polite, the kind of exchange one might expect from two actors well versed in their roles. "Everything looks wonderful, Charles," Lillian said, her voice smooth but cool. "Your efforts haven't gone unnoticed." "Only the best for you," Charles replied, though his eyes darted around the room, as if seeking validation from the gilded frames and silk drapes. It was then that Beatrice Marchmont made her entrance, her timing as impeccable as the cut of her dress. With a bouquet of flowers that seemed more an afterthought than a heartfelt gift, she approached the couple. Her smile was brittle as she handed Lillian the flowers, her eyes lingering on Charles for a moment too long. "Congratulations, Lillian. Charles is a catch, isn't he?" Lillian's response was a nod, cool and composed. "Thank you, Beatrice. We're both very fortunate." As Beatrice retreated, her glance at Lillian carried the weight of unspoken stories and unresolved pasts. The air seemed to thicken with tension, the kind that whispered of old love and new rivalries. In a quieter corner of the manor, Daniel Everett, Lillian's brother, found the moment to corner his sister. His tone was accusatory, a stark contrast to the genteel murmur of the gathering. "You think marrying into money will fix everything. You've always taken what should have been mine." Lillian's face hardened, her polite mask slipping for a brief, revealing moment. "Be careful, Daniel. I know more than you think." Her voice was low, almost a hiss, her eyes flashing a warning that was both chilling and deliberate. Daniel's laugh was hollow, bitter. "We'll see about that, sister. We'll see." As the guests continued to arrive, the manor's opulent halls echoed with the sounds of a party that was as much a show of wealth as it was a battlefield of wits and wills. Above it all, the portraits of deceased Whittakers looked down, their eyes seemingly following the modern drama unfolding below, a reminder that in St. Mary Mead history was never just a backdrop, but a continuous, living influence. The expansive lawns of Whittaker Manor were a spectacle that night, alive with the delicate glow of fairy lights that hung from every tree and balustrade, swaying gently in the cool evening breeze. A string quartet played somewhere out of sight, their melodies floating over the heads of the village elite who had turned out in their finest attire. Champagne flowed as freely as the conversation, though the latter was spiked with undercurrents of curiosity and envy. Miss Marple stood slightly apart from the main throng, a glass of lemonade in her hand, her keen eyes roving over the guests. She took note of the forced smiles and the too loud laughter, storing away each observation with a mental click as precise as a camera shutter. The village might dress up nicely, but the seams of their secrets were still there if one knew where to look. Inspector Harrow made his entrance, his solid frame cutting through the crowd with a policeman's no-nonsense stride. He was greeted by Charles with a handshake that was a little too firm, a little too long. "Good of you to come, John," Charles said, his voice carrying over the murmur of the assembled guests. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Harrow replied, though his eyes darted briefly to the perimeter of the garden as if measuring the space for trouble. Miss Marple watched their exchange with interest. Charles had been a boy when Harrow first came to St. Mary Mead, yet now they spoke like equals, with a familiarity bred from shared, if undisclosed, histories. As the inspector moved off to mingle, Beatrice Marchmont found her moment to strike. She approached Charles with a grace that belied her tension, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that drew the attention of nearby guests. "Recycling old promises into new ones, Charles? How poetic," she said, her voice low and edged with a bitter sarcasm that made a couple of nearby heads turn. Charles's response was a study in forced calm. "Beatrice, always a pleasure to hear your thoughts," he murmured, his smile tight. He excused himself quickly, leaving her simmering with frustration and clutching her champagne flute a little too tightly. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her brain ticking over the nuances of the interaction. Beatrice's anger was not just the residue of a broken heart, it had the sharpness of betrayal, and betrayal, in St. Mary Mead, was a currency as common as the pound. As the party continued, the detective's gaze shifted from face to face, noting alliances and animosities alike. The manor might have been the picture of 1920s opulence, with its sprawling lawns and elegant decor, but to Miss Marple it was a chessboard. Every guest a piece, every polite conversation a move in a much larger game. The night air grew cooler, and the fairy lights seemed to twinkle a bit more mischievously. In the shadowed corners of the garden, secrets clung to the leaves like dewdrops. Miss Marple continued her watch, knowing that at gatherings like these the veneer of civility often cracked, revealing the darker truths beneath. It was only a matter of time. Under the twinkle of 1,000 fairy lights strung across the grand oaks of Whitaker Manor, the garden party reached its crescendo. Charles stood, champagne flute in hand, his other arm extending toward Lillian with a small velvet box that gleamed under the soft illumination. The murmurs of the crowd hushed as he knelt, his voice steady but tinged with an urgency that was not entirely born of romance. "Lillian Everett, will you marry me?" The pause that followed was thick with anticipation. Lillian offered a smile, radiant yet somehow reserved as she accepted. "Yes, Charles, I will." Her voice carried well, but it was her eyes, guarded and scanning, that told a different story. The applause that followed was hearty, but Miss Marple noted the undercurrents. Margaret's jaw was tight, her hands clenched in her silk shawl, while Daniel's face was a mask of stormy disapproval. Across the lawn, unnoticed by most, Harold Langston made a quiet exit into the shadowed facade of the manor. The flash of the photographer's camera captured this moment fleetingly, a ghost image that would later unravel more than just memories. Near the buffet table, Beatrice leaned in to whisper to a companion, her voice low but sharp with venom. "She will be a smile tomorrow." Miss Marple, passing by with her lemonade, caught the words and filed them away like a card in a deck, her eyes briefly meeting Beatrice's before moving on. As the night drew on and the guests began to trickle away in twos and threes, the atmosphere shifted. The fairy lights that had earlier sparkled with promise now seemed to flicker with uncertainty. Charles and Lillian, now officially engaged, stood apart from the remaining guests, their conversation intense and hushed. "You've played your part brilliantly, Lillian," Charles hissed, unaware of Miss Marple lingering near a rosebush. "But remember, this is just the beginning." Lillian's response was cold, her earlier warmth as absent as the setting sun. "You'll regret this, Charles. If you think you can control everything, you're gravely mistaken." With those chilling words, she turned on her heel and walked towards the manor, her silhouette a dark stain against the pale facade. Miss Marple watched as Lillian entered the library alone, the door closing with a definitive click of the lock, as observed by a young steward who hurried past with an armful of discarded napkins. Meanwhile, the garden emptied slowly. Margaret slipped away towards the darker part of the gardens, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Beatrice, her earlier spite replaced with a hollow look of defeat, left abruptly, her departure marked by the gravel crunching angrily under her heels. Harold reappeared from the manor, his composure as meticulously arranged as the cufflinks on his sleeves. The night air grew heavier as Miss Marple made her way back to the house. The pieces were moving, the players were in place, and the game was far from over. In St. Mary Mead, engagements were rarely just celebrations. More often they were preludes to darker deeds. And tonight the shadows whispered of secrets that refused to stay buried. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the thorns on the roses she passed, was ready to delve deeper. The truth, she knew, was rarely simple, and never what it seemed at first glance. Morning light filtered through the mist that clung to St. Mary Mead like a shroud. the sun a pale ghost in the sky. At Whittaker Manor, the tranquillity of the new day was shattered by a scream that cut through the silence. The housemaid, a young woman of sturdy build and usually unflappable nature, stood trembling outside the library door. Her repeated knocks had echoed unanswered, prompting a growing dread that something was terribly wrong. Charles, roused from a restless sleep, arrived in a dishevelled suit, his face ashen. With a force born of panic, he broke open the door. The scene inside the library was a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night's celebration. Lillian lay still upon the chaise lounge, her evening gown undisturbed, a serene expression masking the grim reality of her demise. Beside her a champagne glass perched precariously on the edge of a side table, its contents half drunk, and a torn note beside it, chilling in its simplicity. "I know what you did." The windows were securely locked from the inside, the room otherwise untouched. The opulent space, with its rows of leather-bound books and the faint smell of tobacco and old paper, had become a sealed tomb. Inspector Harrow's car crunched the gravel under its tires as it approached the manor, the sound a grim herald of the day's business. His arrival was swift, his face set in a grim line that spoke of too many similar mornings. Miss Marple, who had been informed of the tragedy by a breathless Mrs. Martineau, was already at the scene, her presence as unobtrusive as it was observant. The inspector, upon entering the library, surveyed the scene with a practised eye. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, he muttered, jotting down notes in his small, worn notebook. His gaze lingered on Lillian, the stillness of the room, and finally the note. "Blackmail?" he pondered aloud, not expecting an answer. Miss Marple, standing by the doorway, watched as Harold Langston, the family solicitor and a frequent visitor to the manor, entered behind Harrow. His usual composure was cracked, his eyes darting around the room, resting uneasily on the note and the glass of champagne. "Distressing, most distressing," he murmured, though it was unclear whether he referred to Lillian's death or the circumstances surrounding it. "It is odd, indeed." Miss Marple finally spoke, her voice causing both men to turn. "That she would drink alone after such a public affair. It's not usual, is it, to seek solitude with a glass of champagne, especially when one is supposedly celebrating?" Her words hung in the air, simple, yet laden with implication. Inspector Harrow considered this, his brow furrowing. "You suggest she wasn't alone, then?" he asked, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift in his mind. "Or that she didn't pour the drink herself," Miss Marple added softly, her eyes on the half-empty glass, as if it might confess more than just its contents. The room seemed to contract, the walls inching closer as the weight of her suggestion sank in. Harrow's eyes moved slowly from the glass to the door, considering the locked windows, the untouched room, and the dead woman who seemed to have simply drifted off to sleep. Nothing was disturbed, yet everything was amiss. As they stood there, the air thick with the scent of old books and newer secrets, the quiet of the manor felt more oppressive than the claustrophobia of any city street. Here, in the heart of St. Mary Mead, the tranquillity of village life was but a veneer, masking the darker currents that flowed beneath. Miss Marple knew this well, her mind working through the facade of peace to unravel the skein of greed, jealousy, and fear that inevitably wove itself through the fabric of human affairs. The morning sun filtered weakly through the stained glass windows of Whittaker Manor, casting colourful but sombre shadows on the faces gathered in the drawing-room. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that clings to the walls after a tragedy, leaving everything it touches a shade darker. Inspector Harrow, his features set in grim determination, began the interviews, his notebook open and pen poised, ready to dissect lies from truth. Charles's interview. Charles sat across from Harrow, an untouched cup of tea cooling beside him. His eyes, red-rimmed and anxious, darted around the room before settling on the inspector. "I was asleep," he insisted, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of desperation. "I heard nothing until the maid screamed." Harrow scribbled down notes, his expression unreadable. "And you were alone, Mr. Whittaker?" he probed, watching Charles closely. "Yes," Charles replied, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "I had retired early. The celebrations, they took more out of me than I expected." His attempt to appear sorrowful might have convinced someone who hadn't seen him manoeuvring through his guests with practised charm just hours before. Miss Marple, observing quietly from a corner, noted the slight tremor in his hands. Remorse or fear of being caught? Margaret's interview. Margaret Whittaker presented a stark contrast to her brother. Upright and composed, she claimed a solitary night wandering the gardens, her alibi as neatly arranged as the pleats of her skirt. The noise, the people, it was too much. I needed solitude, she explained, her voice firm. Quite a lonely way to spend the evening at your brother's engagement party, Harrow remarked dryly, his pen pausing over his notebook. Margaret's lips thinned. Perhaps, but necessary for me. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp behind her knitting, noted the slight clench of Margaret's jaw when the inspector mentioned the time of death, rumoured to coincide with her solitary walk. Beatrice Marchmont's bitterness was not masked by the politeness of her words. I know what you're thinking, Inspector, but I had no reason to harm Lillian. She meant nothing to me, she said, her voice laced with acid. And yet your history with Charles suggests a motive, Harrow countered, his gaze steady. Beatrice laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humour. Love makes us do foolish things, Inspector, but murder is not one of them. I was at home alone, nursing a bottle of wine and my grievances. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the careful avoidance of any mention of the sapphire or her abrupt departure from the party. Daniel Everett was less guarded, his anger palpable as he leaned forward, his fingers clenched. This was never about love. Charles wanted control, and Lillian was his ticket to it. He spat out, his gaze fierce. She knew something dangerous, something that could ruin him. And what might that be, Mr. Everett? Harrow asked, intrigued despite himself. Daniel shook his head, a mixture of fear and defiance in his eyes. Ask him about the sapphire. She found out, and it scared her. As the interviews wound down, Harold Langston's composure began to crumble. When Miss Marple casually inquired about the Whittaker sapphire, his reaction was immediate and telling. He stammered, his forehead beading with sweat. I don't know what you mean. I haven't seen it. It's missing? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a comforting sound amidst the tension. An interesting reaction, Mr. Langston, for someone who claims ignorance, she mused aloud, her gaze fixed on his flustered face. Inspector Harrow caught the exchange, a new thread of inquiry unfolding in his mind. As the pieces began to shift, the picture started to change, revealing the outlines of a motive rooted in greed and desperation. Outside, St. Mary Mead carried on under the weight of its secrets, the village seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents flowing through the manor. But inside, the walls vibrated with the echoes of confession, every word and pause laden with implications that would soon ripple out, disturbing the deceptive peace. In the subdued light of Lillian's bedroom, Miss Marple rifled through a stack of personal correspondence with the delicate touch of someone aware they're uncovering secrets. Her fingers, knitted with age and wisdom, paused on an envelope heavier than the rest. It was addressed to Inspector Harrow, yet clearly never sent. The envelope's seal was broken, a silent invitation to the past. As she unfolded the letter, the writing revealed a nervous hand. Lillian's words were a mixture of fear and determination, hinting at a scandal that had once rocked the foundations of Whittaker Manor, an incident involving shady dealings and a cover-up that implicated none other than Harrow himself. Later, in the quiet confines of the manor's study, Miss Marple handed the letter to Harrow. The inspector, a man usually composed and authoritative, seemed to shrink before her eyes. It was a mistake, one I thought buried, but I didn't kill her, he muttered, his eyes not meeting hers. The defensive tone, the averted gaze, it painted a picture Harrow was desperate to keep hidden. Indeed, Inspector, but where does the truth lie? Miss Marple asked softly, her voice carrying a weight that filled the room, pressing against old walls burdened with secrets. The discovery of the letter had stirred the murky waters, and Harrow, determined to regain some semblance of control, led the next phase of the investigation. They descended into the depths of Whittaker Manor, to a vault that smelled of damp and disuse. The heavy door swung open with a creak of protest, revealing rows of empty shelves and the palpable absence of the Whittaker sapphire. Harold Langston was brought down to the vault, his usual slick demeanour replaced by visible anxiety. Under Harrow's piercing gaze, he confessed to entering the vault during the chaos of the party. It was to retrieve some legal documents at Charles's behest, he claimed, the words rushing out as if eager to absolve him. Charles, when confronted, reacted with vehemence. "That's a lie. I never asked him to fetch anything," he snapped, his face flushed with anger or perhaps fear. The room grew colder, the space between the men charged with unsaid accusations. Miss Marple, recalling the scene at the party's end, spoke up. "Mr. Langston, might I inquire about the condition of your briefcase that evening? It seemed unusually full." Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Harold's response was quick, too quick. "Misplaced?" he stuttered, avoiding her gaze. I don't know where it is now." The inspector and the detective exchanged a look, a silent conversation in a glance. Something was amiss, and the missing briefcase was a piece of this puzzle neither could ignore. As they left the vault, the air felt heavier, laden with the weight of unspoken secrets and lies. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her mind racing through the implications of the discovered letter, the missing jewel, and the tangled web of deception weaving through Whitaker Manor. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead continued its slow pace, oblivious to the storms brewing behind the manor's walls. But within those walls, the threads of deception pulled tighter, each revelation a tug toward an inevitable unravelling that would expose more than just a thief or a murderer. In the quiet aftermath of their investigation, both Harrow and Miss Marple knew that the end, when it came, would shake the very foundations of what appeared to be a tranquil village life. In the dim light of the Whitaker Manor's darkroom, photographs from the night of the party slowly came to life in their chemical baths, each image revealing more than just frozen smiles and festive garb. The village photographer, a wiry man with an eye for detail, worked silently, methodically hanging the wet prints to dry. As each photo clipped to the line, a story unfolded, one that would add new layers to the mystery enveloping the manor. Inspector Harrow and Miss Marple stood side by side, watching as the photographs developed. One particular photo captured their attention. It showed Margaret, dressed in her flowing evening gown, lingering by the library's partially open door. The time-stamp on the photo was damning, placing her there merely minutes before Lillian's estimated time of death. "I was just taking air," Margaret insisted later, under the harsh scrutiny of the inspector's questioning. Her voice was steady, but her fingers betrayed her, twisting a handkerchief into a tight knot. "The library's side door leads to a small garden. It's a place I often find solace." Miss Marple, observing quietly, noted the slight shift in Margaret's gaze as she spoke, a look towards the window, perhaps longing for that same escape now. Another photograph showed Harold, his expression tense, slipping through the manor's side entrance, contradicting his earlier assertion that he had merely stepped out to the garden for a moment. When confronted with the photograph, Harold's composure crumbled like dry bread. "I needed to fetch some documents from my briefcase in the office," he stammered, his earlier confidence dissolving under the weight of visual evidence. The final piece of the photographic puzzle came unexpectedly when Harrow and Miss Marple visited Beatrice's cottage on a hunch. They arrived just in time to see her tossing fragments of a burnt note into the fireplace. What could still be read among the charred remains sent a chill down the spine. She knew. Beatrice, caught in the act, flushed deeply, her aristocratic features hardening. Lillian was always one to find drama where there was none. "I burned the note because I wanted no part of her theatrics," she declared with a dismissive wave of her hand, though her eyes darted nervously to the mantel where the note had likely been displayed. Miss Marple, ever observant, mulled over these revelations as they left the cottage. "People often say they want no part in the drama, yet they cannot help but play their roles on the stage," she mused aloud, her words floating in the air like the smoke from Beatrice's fireplace. Back at the station, Harrow lined up the photographs on the pinboard, each image a piece of the puzzle, each telling a story of hidden motives and clandestine movements. The weight of the evidence was tangible, pressing down on all involved, squeezing tighter and tighter until someone would inevitably break. In the quiet of the village, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, the residents of St. Mary Mead whispered and watched. For in this seemingly tranquil place, beneath the veneer of pastoral peace, lay a web of deceit woven with expert hands. And as Miss Marple knew all too well, it was only a matter of time before the entire web would unravel, revealing the truth hidden in the shadows of Whitaker Manor. St. Mary Mead had its secrets, and so did Whitaker Manor. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the lush gardens, the old house seemed to whisper with echoes of the past. Inside, the atmosphere was charged, every creak and groan of the aged structure loaded with suspicion. It was here, in a seemingly innocuous comment from Mrs. Brenner, the long-time housekeeper, that Miss Marple found the first real crack in the case. "Strange creaks in the walls ever since the party," Mrs. Brenner mentioned offhandedly as she dusted the portrait-line hallway. "More than usual, I mean. The manor is old, but this feels different." Miss Marple, never one to disregard the observations of those who knew a place best, thanked the housekeeper with a nod. Her mind, sharp as a tack, latched onto the comment with keen interest. With a polite excuse, she wandered towards the kitchen, her sensible shoes silent on the polished floor. Behind the scenes of the manor's daily operations lay the old servant passages, a network of forgotten corridors and utility shafts that facilitated the discreet comings and goings of staff long past. The kitchen, with its lingering aromas of the morning's baking, housed one such relic, a disused dumbwaiter, long retired from service. Miss Marple inspected the small elevator, its wood panels dusty and worn. The shaft above led directly to the library, the very room where Lillian had been found. With a thoughtful frown, Miss Marple tugged at the ropes. The mechanism groaned in protest but gave way, the platform descending slowly to her level. "May I?" she asked the sous-chef, who shrugged and nodded, too preoccupied with his preparations to question the gentle old lady's curiosity. Miss Marple tested the dumbwaiter herself, climbing into the cramped space with a determination that belied her age. The ride was tight and smelled of old wood and faintly of mildew, but it worked. She arrived at the library entrance with little fuss, unseen by anyone who might have been in the room at the time. The potential for misuse was clear. A perfect secret passage for a determined murderer. Climbing out, she dusted off her skirt, her mind racing through the implications. If someone knew about this shaft, they could have used it to commit the murder and escape without ever being seen. It was a significant discovery, one that could change the course of the investigation. Back in the kitchen, she thanked the sous-chef with a smile that was both sweet and sly. "You've been most helpful," she said, her eyes twinkling with secrets. As she walked back to the main part of the house, Miss Marple's brain ticked through the possibilities. The housekeeper's words about the creaks, now understood as the sound of the dumbwaiter's ropes and pulleys, the nervous behaviour of Harold, and the inconsistencies in the alibis presented by the family, all these elements began to slot together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. With the discovery of the dumbwaiter, the mystery of how the murderer accessed and exited the library undetected was potentially solved. What remained was discovering who knew enough about the manor to utilize this hidden pathway and why. Miss Marple knew that understanding the motive would lead her to the murderer. As she rejoined Inspector Harrow to share her findings, her mind was abuzz. This was the breakthrough they needed, but it was only the beginning. The final act was yet to unfold, and she was ready to pull the curtain back on the last devastating truth. The air was heavy with the scent of old leather and ink in Harold Langston's office, a room cluttered with the detritus of legal life, piles of documents, law books and files stacked in precarious columns. Miss Marple, her face a mask of polite curiosity, examined the items on his desk with a meticulous eye. A hand paused over a small, elegant ink bottle, its label worn but the deep blue of the ink visible through the glass. "This is a rather unique shade, Mr. Langston," Miss Marple commented, holding the bottle up to the light. "Not something one finds in your average stationer's shop." Harold, his face ashen, watched her with eyes that betrayed his fear. It "A special order. I use it for certain sensitive documents." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, placing the bottle back on the desk. Her gaze met Harold's, sharp and unyielding. "Rather like the ink on the note found next to Miss Everett, wouldn't you say?" The room seemed to shrink around Harold as the implications of her words settled in. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "I can explain," he began, his voice a whisper of its usual confident temper. Miss Marple simply nodded, a gesture for him to continue. "It was all supposed to be a distraction," Harold confessed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The proposal party. I suggested it to Charles. It was the perfect cover to access the vault, to replace some documents that would have implicated me in embezzlement." "And the sapphire?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Harold's laugh was hollow, devoid of humour. "A last-minute temptation. I took it. But then Lillian, she knew. She found out somehow and confronted me, demanded a share, threatened to go to Charles, to the police." Miss Marple listened, her expression impassive as she knit her fingers together, the wool of her gloves soft against the harsh reality of his words. "I panicked," Harold continued. "I thought I could convince her to keep quiet. We met in the library. I poured her a glass of champagne. I had the poison for rats in the garden shed. I thought a little would just make her sick, give me time to think. But then you used the dumb waiter to escape," Miss Marple finished for him, her voice soft but carrying a steel edge, "and staged your presence back at the party, an alibi crafted in desperation." Harold nodded, defeated. "Yes, I never meant for her to die." Miss Marple stood, her figure straightening as she prepared to leave the room. "Intentions often stray far from actions, Mr. Langston. Your fear led you down this dark path. Now it is time for the consequences." Inspector Harrow, who had been standing silent at the doorway, stepped forward, his expression grim. "We'll need you to come with us, Mr. Langston." As Harold was led away, Miss Marple lingered by the desk, her eyes catching a glimpse of the Whittaker sapphire peeking out from beneath a stack of papers in Harold's open briefcase. A glint of blue amidst the grey of legal mundanities. The gem, like the truth, had a way of coming to light no matter how deeply buried. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead continued its slow pace, the tranquillity of the day belying the storm that had just passed through the manor. For Miss Marple, the resolution of the case brought no joy, only a sombre satisfaction in restoring order, her belief unshaken that behind every serene facade the spectres of greed and desperation lurked, waiting for a chance to emerge. The air in St. Mary Mead carried the crispness of an early spring day, but the mood within Whittaker Manor was decidedly sombre. Harold Langston, his hands cuffed and his usual confident demeanour shattered, was led away by local police. The sight of the once respected solicitor, now fallen from grace, sent murmurs rippling through the gathered crowd. Charles Whittaker stood on the steps of the manor, his figure slightly stooped, the weight of public disgrace pressing down on him. While he had not been aware of Harold's lethal intentions, his involvement in the initial plot for theft had been enough to tarnish his reputation irreparably. The whispers of the villagers, once filled with admiration, now carried undertones of scorn. Inspector Harrow, his usual composed self, seeming more brittle today, approached Miss Marple before departing. The lines on his face seemed deeper, each one a mark of the burdens he had carried. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of resignation and respect, "your insights have been invaluable. Justice is best served by those who see beyond the surface. I find it's time for me to step aside. Let fresher eyes look over St. Mary Mead." His gaze lingered on the horizon, perhaps seeing his career as the sun setting slowly in the distance. Miss Marple offered him a small, understanding smile. "Inspector, you've served well. Sometimes our own shadows grow too long, and we must step away to see the light again." As Harrow nodded, his departure marked the end of an era for St. Mary Mead's law enforcement, and a stark reminder of the personal costs often paid in the pursuit of truth. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair at the local tea shop, a steaming cup of Earl Grey in hand, reflecting on the case. The shop buzzed quietly with the day-to-day banter of its patrons, a stark contrast to the recent upheavals. As she sipped her tea, her thoughts were pensive. In small villages, secrets sprout like weeds, she mused aloud, though more to herself than anyone else. But lies always bloom brightest before being plucked out. Her gaze drifted to the window, watching as the villagers went about their daily routines, most unaware of the undercurrents that had just shifted beneath their feet. This case, like many before it, had peeled back the layers of tranquility that small towns like St. Mary Mead so often took for granted. It had revealed the tangled roots of greed, jealousy, and fear that lay hidden underneath the surface, waiting for the right set of circumstances to bring them to light. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her eyes reflecting a wisdom born of years observing human nature. The resolution of the case did not bring joy, nor did it dispel the shadows that had momentarily darkened the village's doors. Instead, it served as a reminder of the resilience of truth and the inevitability of justice, how it bends not swiftly but inevitably towards righteousness. As she left the tea shop, her steps were measured and calm, her mind already turning over the details of her next knitting project, a pattern as intricate as the mysteries she so deftly unravelled. In St. Mary Mead, life would go on, the village would heal, and Miss Marple would be there, a steady presence ready to tackle the next puzzle that came her way. St. Mary Mead's Market Square, usually a hub for quaint village activities, had turned into a hotbed of gossip and speculation. The recent arrest of Harold Langston, intertwined with the grim revelation of Lillian Everett's murder, had sent ripples through the community, transforming the usual banal chatter into intense debate and theorizing. Under the dull morning sky, villagers gathered in small clusters around the post office and the weathered benches near the grocer's shop. Their voices were a mix of hushed tones and abrupt exclamations, each person eager to inject their opinion into the mix. Miss Marple, her presence almost unnoticed, stood near the fountain that marked the square's centre, her hands clasped in front of her as she listened intently. Mrs. Hartnell, ever the proponent of complex theories, was gesturing wildly with a loaf of bread in hand. "Harold's too clever to be caught so easily. There must be someone else involved," she asserted, her eyes scanning the crowd as if she might spot the culprit among them. Miss Marple offered a non-committal hum in response, her eyes thoughtful. Mrs. Hartnell's point, while speculative, wasn't without merit. The layers of deception in the case could very well conceal another player in the dark drama that had unfolded. Nearby, at the bakery's front, a heated argument broke out, drawing the attention of several onlookers. Beatrice Marchmont, her face flushed with anger, was in a sharp exchange with Margaret Whittaker. "Dragging the Whittaker name through scandal as if it's some parlour game," Beatrice accused, her finger jabbing in the air for emphasis. Margaret, equally incensed, retorted, her voice rising, "Perhaps if you hadn't chased my brother like a lovesick fool, we wouldn't be in this mess." Their words, laced with years of bitterness and regret, hung heavily in the air, drawing murmurs from the gathering crowd. Miss Marple watched the exchange with a keen eye, noting the underlying pain and fury that drove both women. Their public display was more than a simple quarrel. It was a venting of long-suppressed grievances that the current crisis had brought to a head. As the crowd absorbed the spectacle, Charles Whittaker moved through the square, his usual confident stride replaced by a hesitant, almost shuffling gait. His face, pale and drawn, avoided meeting the eyes of his fellow villagers. The weight of his family's legacy, coupled with the recent events, seemed to press down on him, bending his frame. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, her mind piecing together the visible signs of a man burdened not only by scandal but perhaps by knowledge yet unrevealed. His behaviour was that of someone entangled not just in legal trouble, but in a web of moral and emotional conflicts that had no easy resolution. As the murmurs around the square continued, Miss Marple slowly walked away, her thoughts deep and troubled. St. Mary Mead might appear to be merely a picturesque village caught up in a tragic mystery, but beneath its charming exterior lurked complexities and secrets that would challenge even the most astute observer. In this tangled web of alibis and accusations, finding the truth would require not just keen observation, but an understanding of the darkest corners of human nature. Miss Marple, with her unassuming appearance and sharp intellect, was up to the task, ready to peel back the layers of pretense and reveal the core of the mystery, however unsettling it might prove. Whitaker Manor stood, a stately silhouette against the grey afternoon sky, its grandeur dimmed by recent events. As Miss Marple approached the heavy oak door, her footsteps echoed slightly on the stone path, a lonely sound that seemed absorbed by the ivy-clad walls of the estate. The manor, once bustling with life, now exuded a sombre quietude, as if it too mourned the scandal that had ensnared its inhabitants. Upon entering, the chill of the grand hall wrapped around Miss Marple, the opulent curtains and portraits of stern ancestors doing little to warm the atmosphere. She was met by Margaret, whose usual poise was undercut by a visible tension that tugged at the corners of her eyes. "Determined to tie up loose threads, are we?" Margaret quipped with a wry smile as she led Miss Marple into the drawing-room, where a pot of tea served in china that faintly rattled with Margaret's unsteady hands, the conversation turned to the crux of the matter. "I'm relieved Harold was caught, of course," Margaret began, her voice steady but her fingers worrying the edge of her teacup. "But something doesn't sit right with me. Harold was greedy, yes, but a murderer? He was always more coward than killer." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes sharp as she sipped her tea. "Fear can sometimes drive a man to extremes he himself would not anticipate," she mused, setting down her cup. "But let us not assume all threads are neatly tied, dear." With Margaret's reluctant permission, Miss Marple wandered the halls of the manor, her keen gaze missing nothing. As she passed the library, a detail caught her eye. A series of fresh scratches near the dumbwaiter's entrance, stark against the polished wood. They spoke of recent, perhaps hurried use, adding weight to her suspicion that not all secrets had yet come to light. Continuing her investigation, Miss Marple made her way to Charles's study, a room dense with the scent of leather and desperation. Among the papers strewn about the desk, a folder marked "Private" drew her attention. Inside she found documents pertaining to offshore accounts and several cryptic notes about financial transactions. The numbers told a story of significant monetary distress, far greater than what had been publicly acknowledged by the Whitaker family. As Miss Marple pieced together the fragments of information, the picture that emerged was one of a family ensnared not just by personal greed, but by a collective desperation that had perhaps driven one of their own to commit unspeakable acts. The manor, with its looming portraits and whispering corridors, felt like a mausoleum to vanished grandeur, holding its breath as the last secrets strained to be uncovered. Stepping out of the study, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the dimming light filtering through the stained-glass windows, casting colourful patterns on the floor. The manor, for all its stately beauty, was a cage of gilded bars for those caught in its legacy. As she left the room, her mind was busy knitting the loose ends, her thoughts as tangled as the web of deceit she was determined to unravel. "Secrets are the currency of the manor, it seems," she whispered to herself as she prepared to leave, her mind already turning over the evidence. With a final glance at the fading opulence around her, Miss Marple stepped back into the fading light of the day, ready to weave the truth from the shadows of St. Mary Mead. The village inn, usually a cosy refuge from the often unpredictable English weather, felt particularly welcoming as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead. Inside, the fire crackled comfortingly, casting warm shadows across the wooden beams, and the locals gathered for an evening pint. Miss Marple, having returned from the grand but now grim Whitaker Manor, found Inspector Harrow waiting for her by the fireplace, a pint of ale untouched at his side. As she approached, Harrow's expression, typically composed and unreadable, betrayed a flicker of doubt. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice low, "Harold's confession has neatly wrapped up the case, but it sits ill with me. He admitted everything. Too easily, if you ask me, almost like he was covering for someone." Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite him, her face thoughtful. "Yes, it's often the case that the easiest solution is not the correct one, but merely the most convenient," she murmured, her fingers absently smoothing the crease of her skirt. Harrow nodded, leaning forward slightly. "The poison, digitalis. It's common enough around here. Anyone could have got their hands on it. And yet, Harrod pointed to no one else, took all the blame upon himself. It's not sitting right." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind turning over the facts like stones beneath a stream. "Indeed, and while Harold's greed is palpable, his capacity for murder seems less certain. And there's the matter of the foxglove. It's a plant well known in our gardens, not something one needs to sneak about to acquire." The inspector looked relieved at her understanding. "Exactly. And there's another thing," he added, his gaze sharpening. "You mentioned Beatrice was quite disturbed by the event, more so than mere social scandal would warrant." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with sharp intelligence. "Yes, Beatrice. She was most agitated, and her reaction to Lillian's death was more than just an old flame scorched by jealousy. She knew more, I suspect." Harold's brow furrowed in thought. "If Harold wasn't working alone, the question remains, who else stood to gain from Lillian's silence?" He took a slow sip of his ale, letting the bitterness linger. Miss Marple leaned back, her gaze drifting to the window where the last light of day gave way to the encroaching night. "That, Inspector, is indeed the question, and in answering it we may uncover more than mere complicity in theft, but a web of deceit woven through the very heart of St. Mary Mead." They sat together for a while, the hum of village chatter around them a stark contrast to the gravity of their conversation. Miss Marple's mind was alive with possibilities, each more intriguing and disturbing than the last. She knew that the key to unravelling this mystery lay not just in the facts presented, but in understanding the human heart, with all its dark corners and hidden desires. As Harrow prepared to leave, he looked at Miss Marple with new-found respect. "I've always valued your insight, Miss Marple. It seems this village could use your keen observation now more than ever." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you, Inspector. Together I believe we shall cut through these tangled threads. After all, every knot has its loose end." The night deepened around the village inn, shadows stretching long across the old stones, as inside the fire's glow promised warmth and light. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead, deceptively quiet, continued to harbour secrets, but Miss Marple was ready to pluck them out one by one. St. Mary Mead's church, a structure of old stone and stained glass, stood as a silent keeper of the village's most guarded secrets. Miss Marple, armed with a polite smile and an unyielding resolve, approached Reverend Granger in the quiet solitude of the church archives, a repository of records as old as the village itself. "Reverend Granger, might I trouble you for a look at the parish records? There are matters concerning the Whittaker family that might shed some light on recent events," she requested, her voice as soft as the dust motes dancing in the slanted light through the stained glass. Reverend Granger, a man of both faith and caution, hesitated as he regarded Miss Marple. The lines around his eyes deepened as he considered her request. Finally he nodded, leading her to a heavy wooden cabinet filled with leather-bound volumes that smelled of time and care. As they leafed through the delicate pages, Miss Marple inquired, "Reverend, were there not some scandal years ago, something involving the Whittakers that was rather hushed up?" The Reverend sighed, a sound of a man burdened by the confidences of his congregation. "Yes, indeed. It involved a young servant girl named Emily. She claimed that Charles Whittaker was the father of her child. The affair caused quite the stir, though it was swiftly settled out of the public eye." "And how was it settled?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Harold Langston managed the matter, paid off the girl, it was rumoured. The family wanted it kept quiet, and Harold was instrumental in ensuring it stayed that way." This piece of history painted a complex picture of loyalty and desperation, framing Harold not just as a solicitor, but as a keeper of the family's darkest secrets. Miss Marple thanked the Reverend, her mind buzzing with the implications of this revelation. Leaving the dim coolness of the church archives, Miss Marple made her way towards the Whittaker estate. The overgrown gardens, once the pride of the manor, now bore the unkempt look of neglect, with wild foxglove thriving unchecked. As she walked, she overheard the gardener speaking to a helper. "Funny thing, those plants were nearly uprooted last week. Someone changed their mind, I suppose," he remarked, scratching his head. Miss Marple paused, considering the foxglove. Beautiful yet deadly, capable of stopping a heart as easily as it caught the eye. The potential for murder hidden in plain sight. At that moment Margaret Whittaker appeared, her pale face seeming almost spectral against the lush, green backdrop. Seeing Miss Marple, she approached with a wary expression. "Miss Marple, I've been meaning to clear out some of those old plants. Nasty things, foxglove, poisonous." "And yet they remain," Miss Marple observed mildly. Margaret's gaze faltered. I thought better of it. But if you think I'd stoop to poison, you're mistaken," she added quickly, a flush rising to her cheeks. Miss Marple studied Margaret for a long moment, her thoughts turning like the pages back in the archives. "My dear, sometimes what we intend matters less than how others perceive it, and sometimes we protect not just ourselves but others." Perhaps without fully understanding why, Margaret looked away, the shadows of the garden playing across her face, deepening the lines of worry and doubt. Miss Marple continued her stroll, her mind weaving together the strands of past and present, the hidden truths and the overt lies, each as intricate and tangled as the vines that climb the old stone walls of Whittaker Manor. The road to Beatrice Marchmont's cottage was lined with the last blooms of autumn, the crisp air filled with the scent of fading flowers and the earthy promise of oncoming winter. Miss Marple, wrapped in her sensible tweed coat, approached the modest dwelling nestled on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. The cottage, with its quaint garden and ivy-clad walls, seemed a world away from the grandeur and concealed decay of Whittaker Manor. Upon her arrival, Miss Marple was greeted by Beatrice, who appeared both startled and wary of the unannounced visit. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Beatrice asked, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "I'm here seeking a bit of clarity on recent troubling events," Miss Marple began, accepting the invitation to step inside. The interior of the cottage was warm, the small fire crackling in the hearth. As they sat, the comfort of the room stood in stark contrast to the discomfort evident in Beatrice's posture. After a few moments of small talk, Beatrice's defences began to crumble. I received an anonymous letter several weeks before the murder," she confessed, her fingers nervously twisting a lace handkerchief. "It warned me to stay away from Charles or face the consequences." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, encouraging Beatrice to continue. "At first I thought it was Lillian. It made sense. She was protective of her new position with Charles. But now—" Her voice trailed off, her gaze lost in the dancing flames of the fireplace. "Lillian knew things, Miss Marple. Dangerous things, not just about Charles, but about others close to him. She wasn't just marrying for money, she was digging into his past, and perhaps she dug too deep." Beatrice's revelation added a complex layer to the mystery. Miss Marple pondered this new information, her mind working through the implications. If not Lillian, who then? Who else would benefit from keeping away from Charles, and who else might fear what Lillian could reveal? Beatrice shook her head, a mix of fear and frustration evident in her eyes. "I don't know. I've been so wrapped up in my own troubles with Charles that I didn't see the larger picture. Now I wonder if we were all just pieces in a more dangerous game." The confession was a significant piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple knew that this anonymous letter could be the key to unravelling the entire affair. Whoever sent it had a motive, not just to threaten Beatrice, but potentially to control or silence Lillian. As Miss Marple stood to leave, her eyes sweeping the cosy room one last time, she offered Beatrice a gentle, reassuring nod. "Thank you, my dear. You've been more helpful than you might realize. Rest assured, the truth tends to emerge, no matter how deeply it's buried." Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple felt the weight of the secrets that pressed upon the village. each revelation leading to more questions. But as the pieces began to fit together, the outlines of the truth were slowly coming into view. That Mary Mead might have been a place of hidden depths and disguised motives, but it also had an uncanny way of revealing its secrets to those patient enough to uncover them. The air was heavy and stale in the visiting room of the local jail where Harold Langston awaited his fate. The man who once commanded respect and fear in equal measure now looked diminished, his sharp suit replaced by the plain clothes issued to him upon his arrest. The room, with its stark white walls and a thick glass partition, was a far cry from the lush interiors of Whittaker Manor. Miss Marple sat across from Harold, her demeanour calm and observant, her eyes betraying none of the keen insight that churned behind them. She watched him closely, noting the slump of his shoulders and the way his hands fidgeted nervously on the tabletop. Harold looked up, meeting her gaze with a mixture of resignation and defiance. "Yes, I stole the sapphire. Yes, I helped cover up Charles's old scandals," he confessed, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "But I didn't poison her." Miss Marple remained silent, giving him space to continue. Harold leaned in, lowering his voice as though afraid of being overheard. "I was coerced," he admitted, his eyes darting nervously. "Someone promised to protect me from the consequences if I took all the blame. They said if I didn't, I'd regret it, and I believed them." The revelation was a stark one, and it suggested a manipulator working from the shadows, wielding influence and fear with equal proficiency. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the threads of deception that wove through the village, pulling at the fabric of many lives. "Who coerced you, Harold?" Miss Marple asked softly, her tone gentle yet insistent. Harold shook his head, a mix of fear and frustration etching deeper lines into his already worn face. "I can't say. They have ways of reaching people that you wouldn't believe. I'm not safe, even here." Miss Marple nodded, understanding the gravity of his fear. Someone powerful enough to manipulate Harold and orchestrate his confession was still out there, a dangerous shadow cast across Mary Mead. The question now was not just who had poisoned Lillian, but who stood to benefit the most from silencing her permanently. As she stood to leave, Miss Marple placed her hand gently on the glass, her expression one of resolute determination. "Thank you, Harold, for your honesty. Rest assured the truth will come to light." Stepping out into the crisp air, Miss Marple felt the weight of the unsolved questions pressing upon her. The village, with its quaint charm and hidden depths, was caught in a web of deceit spun by a master. But as she walked back towards the heart of St. Mary Mead, her step was firm, her resolve unshaken. The accomplice, whoever they were, had underestimated the tenacity of the villagers and the keen mind of one Miss Marple. As the shadows lengthened and the day gave way to dusk, it was only a matter of time before she would pull at the right thread, unravelling the facade and revealing the true architect of the sinister plot. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the mullioned windows of Whittaker Manor, casting long shadows across its aged oak floors. The grand house, while echoing with the whispers of past discretions and present woes, held its secrets close, a fact Miss Marple was acutely aware of as she ascended the staircase to Lillian's room once more. Her purpose was clear: delve deeper into Lillian's personal effects, which might yet reveal motives and machinations hidden from the initial investigation. The room, untouched since the day of Lillian's death, was a frozen tableau of her life. Miss Marple, with her characteristic meticulousness, began her search. Drawers were opened, contents sorted with a gentle yet determined touch. It was at the vanity, an elegant piece marred by the dust of recent events, that she discovered something amiss. A false bottom in one of the drawers. Carefully, Miss Marple manipulated the hidden mechanism, revealing a slim, leather-bound journal. The diary was a window into Lillian's private thoughts, penned with an emotional intensity that contrasted sharply with her public poise. Flipping through the pages, Miss Marple found detailed accounts of Charles's personal failings and Harold's financial misconduct. Lillian had written explicitly about using this information as leverage, her tone oscillating between righteousness and vindictiveness. The last entry, however, was what drew Miss Marple's focus. It read, "I've confronted him. He was livid. If anything happens to me, it's no accident." The ambiguity of him was deliberate, leaving a frustrating gap in the narrative. Lillian, it seemed, was well aware of the dangers her knowledge posed, yet she had underestimated the lengths to which her adversaries would go. Miss Marple sat back, the journal resting in her lap, her mind racing through the implications. This new evidence not only reinforced the motive for murder, but also painted a picture of Lillian not just as a victim, but as a player in a dangerous game of power and blackmail. The use of the vague him suggested she feared implicating her antagonist directly, perhaps knowing well that her words might one day be read by others. With the journal as a new piece of pivotal evidence, Miss Marple knew she needed to tread carefully. Whoever Lillian had confronted, the real murderer, was likely still watching, still involved in the day-to-day life of the village. The stakes were higher now. The murderer was not just covering up a crime of passion, but a premeditated act to silence a threatening voice. The room around her seemed to close in, the walls themselves holding back whispered secrets of decades. As the light faded, casting the room into shadows, Miss Marple made her way back downstairs, the journal secure under her arm. She needed to share this discovery with Inspector Harrow, yet part of her cautioned the less the murderer knew about their unravelling plans, the better. As she passed through the manor's corridors, the weight of history and the urgency of justice bore down upon her. St. Mary Mead, for all its pastoral charm, was not immune to the darkness of human desires and deeds. But as long as Miss Marple was there, the truth would not remain buried, no matter how deep the roots of deception ran. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the tidy lawns of Whittaker Manor, Miss Marple made her way to Charles Whittaker's private study. The air inside was thick with the musty smell of books and a lingering tension that seemed almost palpable. Charles, who had been staring out the window at the fading light, turned sharply as Miss Marple entered, his expression one of guarded apprehension. "Miss Marple," he greeted stiffly, his voice betraying a note of unease. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Miss Marple, unfazed by his formal demeanour, calmly produced Lillian's journal from her bag, placing it deliberately on the mahogany desk between them. "I believe this might interest you, Mr. Whittaker," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp beneath her tweed hat. Charles paled as he recognized the journal. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, each entry a confirmation of his deepest fears exposed. He sank into his chair, the facade of control crumbling. "I knew she was planning to use what she knew to manipulate me," he admitted, his voice low and strained. "I wanted her quieted, yes, but I never intended this. I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. You must believe me." Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the desperation in his eyes. "Wanting silence and wanting death are two very different things, Mr. Whittaker. But someone took her intentions for silence and turned them into permanent silence." Before Charles could respond, Inspector Harrow entered the room, his expression grim. "We have new evidence," he announced, holding up a plastic evidence bag containing the torn note found beside Lillian's body. "The fingerprints on this note aren't Lillian's or Harold's. They belong to Margaret." The revelation struck like a bolt, tightening the web of suspicion even further. Charles looked stunned, turning to Miss Marple with a bewildered expression. "Margaret? But why? How?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. "It seems we are dealing with a case of misplaced loyalty, and perhaps misunderstood intentions. Margaret, it appears, may have taken your words about quieting Lillian too seriously, or perhaps she had her own reasons for wanting Lillian silenced." The room filled with tense silence as the implications sank in. Miss Marple continued, "Let us speak with Margaret. It's time we cleared this tangled web once and for all." The group made their way to Margaret's quarters, the atmosphere charged with the heavy weight of impending revelations. Upon confronting her with the evidence, Margaret's composure finally broke. "I did it for the family," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. "Charles didn't know. I couldn't watch our name being dragged through the mud because of her. I thought I was protecting us all." Her confession was both a relief and a tragedy, unravelling the final threads of the mystery. As Harrow took Margaret into custody, Miss Marple looked out at the darkening sky, her thoughts sober. "Justice sometimes reveals truths we would rather not see," she reflected quietly, her words more to herself than to anyone else. "And in seeking to protect our own, we can sometimes cause the greatest harm." As the night settled over St. Mary Mead, the case of Lillian's death closed with a bitter resolution, leaving the village to wrestle with the darker sides of loyalty and love, a poignant reminder that the quietest places often harbour the deepest shadow. The grand salon of Whittaker Manor, with its high ceilings adorned with intricate plasterwork and walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors, had seen many gatherings, but none quite as charged as this. The room, usually echoing with echoes of past grandeur, now thrummed with the tension of the present. The fading light of day cast long shadows across the richly carpeted floor, adding a dramatic flair to the gathering. At the centre of it all was Miss Marple, her demeanour calm and authoritative as she stood before Charles, Margaret, Beatrice, Daniel, and Harold, who was closely watched by an officer. Inspector Harrow, a silent sentinel, stood to the side, his keen eyes missing nothing. "Thank you all for joining," Miss Marple began, her voice steady and commanding attention. "We are here to unravel a tangle that has ensnared not just one among you, but has implications for us all." She walked slowly in front of the suspects, her gaze sharp and discerning. "Let us consider the facts," she continued, turning first to Harold. "Mr. Langston confessed to theft and implicated himself in a murder most foul. Yet this confession rather conveniently absolves everyone else while condemning himself, a sacrifice that is both noble and, I suspect, fabricated." Turning to Beatrice, Miss Marple's tone softened slightly. "And dear Miss Marchmont, whose fiery temper and public confrontations with Lillian provided such splendid misdirection, but anger, while it can lead to violence, often serves better as a smoke-screen hiding the true fires burning quietly elsewhere." Her eyes then flicked to Daniel, whose bitterness and resentment had been palpable. "Mr. Everett, your grievances against Charles provided a motive, yes, but also a distraction. Your animosity was too overt, too obvious. Real guilt prefers the shadows, not the spotlight." Each statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. As she laid bare each motive and opportunity, the suspects shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words pressing down upon them. Finally, Miss Marple turned to face Charles and Margaret together. "Which brings us to you two, brother and sister, each with much to lose and much to cover. It was Charles's secrets that Lillian threatened to expose, but Margaret, your protective instincts for family honour and your brother's reputation perhaps spurred you to act." The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the group once more, her expression one of deep seriousness. "Harold's confession was a lie, engineered by fear. Beatrice's anger and Daniel's bitterness were but diversions, smoke billowing to obscure our view from the fire's true origin." Stepping closer to the duo at the centre of the web, she concluded, "It is often the case that those closest to the threat are the ones who feel the most compelled to extinguish it, whatever the cost." Inspector Harrow stepped forward, ready to act on Miss Marple's implicit signal. The room, once abuzz with whispered theories and veiled accusations, now held its breath, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to click into place. As Miss Marple prepared to reveal the true culprit, the weight of history, family loyalty, and hidden secrets bore down upon the occupants of Whittaker Manor. The truth, sharp and unavoidable, was about to shatter the fragile peace, revealing that in the pursuit of preservation one often finds ruin. In the opulently draped grand salon of Whittaker Manor the atmosphere was charged with tension, every eye fixed on Margaret as Miss Marple prepared to lay bare the truth behind the facade of familial loyalty and desperation. "Margaret," Miss Marple began, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the heavy air, "it has become increasingly clear that you stood to lose the most from Lillian's union with Charles. Not just familial affection, but control over the estate that has been in your stewardship." The room held its breath, as Margaret, her posture once composed and imperious, now seemed to shrink under the weight of accusation. Her eyes, wide with a mix of fear and defiance, flicked around the room, seeking an ally where there were none. Miss Marple continued, methodical and relentless, "With Lillian as your sister-in-law, your influence over Charles and the estate's future would undoubtedly wane. She was not just a threat to your brother's reputation, but to your position within this family." Margaret's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white as she struggled to maintain her composure. The walls of the manor, steeped in history and secrets, seemed to close in around her. Finally, with nowhere left to hide, her resolve crumbled. "Yes, I confronted her," Margaret confessed, her voice breaking as the words tumbled out. "I wanted to scare her into leaving Charles alone. I told her she didn't understand what she was meddling with, the secrets she would unearth." Her eyes, now brimming with tears, met Miss Marple's steady gaze. "But she laughed at me, said she'd ruin us all. I didn't mean to—" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression one of solemn understanding. "You used the foxglove extract prepared for your gardening experiments, didn't you?" she asked, her tone more sad than accusatory. Margaret nodded, sobbing quietly. "It was just to be a warning, to make her ill, to frighten her. I never meant for her to die." The revelation sent a murmur through the room. Inspector Harrow stepped forward, his duty clear, but his demeanour showing a trace of sympathy for the woman undone by her own fears. "Harold's theft," Miss Marple added, turning to address the others, "though grievous, served merely as a convenient cover for Margaret. His own crimes, while significant, were independent of the tragedy that befell Lillian." As Harrow gently took Margaret by the arm, guiding her towards the resolution awaiting her beyond the manor's grand walls, Miss Marple addressed the sombre assembly. "Let this be a reminder that fear, when allowed to fester, can lead to dire consequences. It blinds us, turns us against each other, and in the end can destroy much more than it protects." The room was silent as the weight of her words sank in, each person reflecting on the cost of secrets and lies. As Margaret was led away, the grand salon seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating with her departure, leaving behind a family forever changed, and a village that would slowly heal from the wounds of this revelation. Outside, the shadows lengthened as dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, the last light glinting off the manor's windows. Inside, Miss Marple prepared to leave, her job done, the truth revealed, but the sorrow of the outcome a heavy cloak around her shoulders. This case, like all others, was a mix of justice and tragedy, the resolution bittersweet as it often was in the human heart's complex weave. The grand salon of Whittaker Manor, which had just witnessed the unravelling of a family's darkest secrets, now stood silent and sombre as Margaret was led away by Inspector Harrow. Her shoulders were hunched, a physical manifestation of the weight of her guilt and the relief of unburdened truths. As she passed through the threshold, her last glance back was not one of longing, but of resignation to her fate. Charles, left behind in the echoing vastness of the room that had seen generations of Whittakers rise and fall, sank into an antique chair. His hands covered his face briefly before he looked up, his voice barely audible. "This family, we destroy everything we touch." The words hung heavily in the air, a lament for more than just the current tragedy. Miss Marple, her work there nearly done, remained a moment longer, observing Charles. Her heart twinged with sympathy for the man who had lost much more than he bargained for, not just a sister and a prospective bride, but perhaps a part of his soul. Inspector Harrow, who had returned briefly after ensuring Margaret was in the custody of his officers, approached Miss Marple with a look of profound respect and gratitude. "Miss Marple, you've done what we couldn't, seen past the lies," he said earnestly. "Your insight has not only solved a murder, but perhaps even saved this family from further ruin." Miss Marple gave a small, sad smile. "Thank you, Inspector, though I wish the truth had been less costly. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are with the demons within our own walls." As they stepped outside, The setting sun cast long shadows across the manor's impressive facade, the golden hues painting the scene with an almost ethereal quality. The air was cooler now, the earlier tension dissipated, leaving a contemplative quietude. "Miss Marple," Harrow continued as they walked down the manor's grand steps, "your ability to unravel the complexities of human nature never ceases to amaze me. St. Mary Mead is lucky to have you." "And I it," she responded quietly, looking back at the manor, "though I sometimes think it is less about luck and more about being a reminder that, no matter how deeply buried, the truth has a way of coming to light." They reached the gate, and Miss Marple turned to Harrow. "Ensure that Margaret gets the help she needs. This was a crime of desperation, not malice. And Charles? He needs support, not isolation." "I will," Harrow promised, his tone solemn. Miss Marple nodded, then started her walk back to the heart of the village, her silhouette a steady presence against the shifting shades of the evening sky. Behind her, Whittaker Manor stood silent, its secrets laid bare and its future uncertain, but for the first time, in a long time, there was a chance for healing. St. Mary Mead, with its quaint charm and hidden depths, continued under the watchful eyes of its most keen observer. Justice had been delivered, not with the sharp sting of retribution, but with the quiet dignity of truth. And as the stars began to twinkle above, Miss Marple knew that, come what may, the village and its people would endure stronger for the trials they had overcome. The quiet of St. Mary Mead, so often a facade for deeper undercurrents, had returned. But not without changes. The village buzzed with whispers that clung to the crisp air, discussions of the recent tumultuous events that had unfolded at Whittaker Manor. As the days stretched into weeks, the reality of the revelations began to settle into the fabric of the community. Charles, weighed down by the scandal and loss, made the difficult decision to sell the manor. One morning, just as the village cockle announced the dawn, he was seen driving away from the village, his car packed, his glance backward fleeting, a silent goodbye to a life he could no longer bear. Beatrice, now free from the chains of unrequited love and public scrutiny, slowly began to find her footing again. Though heartbroken, she started to rebuild her life, her dignity intact, her spirit gradually healing from the wounds of betrayal and lost love. Harold, whose theft had been overshadowed by the more sinister aspects of the case, faced justice in a quieter, albeit significant manner. Sentenced to prison for his crimes, he was spared more severe punishment thanks to his cooperation with the authorities. His role as a pawn in a larger game, while not excusing his actions, had been considered in his sentencing. Daniel, the dark horse of the saga, found himself unexpectedly wealthy, having inherited a portion of Lillian's estate. The village buzzed anew with rumours about his sudden ascent to wealth, speculations abounding about what he would do with his newfound resources. In the cosy confines of her favourite tea-shop, Miss Marple met with Mrs. Hartnell for their routine afternoon tea. The shop was a haven of normalcy, the air filled with the scent of brewing tea and fresh scones. "As tragic as the events were," Miss Marple observed, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "they remind us that murder is never just about the act itself. It's about the small, festering grievances that grow unchecked until they poison more than just the mind." Mrs. Hartnell, who had followed the case with a mix of horror and fascination, sighed deeply. "At least it's all over," she said, hoping to find solace in the conclusion. Miss Marple, her eyes wise and knowing, glanced out the window where the village life carried on, children playing near the fountain, elders chatting by the post office. "Is it ever truly over, my dear?" she mused aloud. "Secrets have a way of echoing, resurfacing when you least expect them to." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, but the lesson of the recent past lingered between them, a reminder of the complexities of human nature and the shadows that danced just beneath the surface of everyday life. In the sterile, brightly lit interrogation room of the St. Mary Mead police station, Margaret Whittaker sat across from Inspector Harrow, her appearance a stark departure from the composed figure she usually presented. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, her face was pale, her usual poised demeanour replaced by visible trembling. As she began to speak, her voice was a mere whisper, each word seeming to cost her greatly. "Lillian wasn't just after Charles. She wanted the entire estate," Margaret confessed, her eyes downcast. "She threatened to expose everything. Charles's past, my father's debts, even Harold's embezzlement. She would have torn our family apart." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I only intended to frighten her with the note and the foxglove extract. A mild dose. I thought it would make her ill, convince her to leave town. Not kill her." Inspector Harrow leaned forward, his expression stern, yet not without a touch of sympathy. "Yet you mixed a lethal dose," he pressed, his voice even. Margaret's facade finally broke, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "I misjudged. It was a grave error. I never thought. I didn't want her to die." The room fell silent, save for the soft buzz of the overhead lights, the gravity of her admission hanging heavily between them. Leaving the police station, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village square, her keen eyes observing the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The usual buzz of gossip that animated the local folk now carried a sombre tone, the thrill of scandal replaced by the weight of tragedy. As she passed by the churchyard, her gaze fell upon the foxglove swaying gently in the breeze, beautiful yet deadly. "Poison in plain sight," she murmured, a note of sadness in her voice for the simple plants now forever associated with such grim events. Mrs. Hartnell approached, her face etched with concern. "Terrible business, Miss Marple. You were right from the start, of course." Miss Marple offered a slight smile, her response tinged with her characteristic modesty. "No, my dear, I merely paid attention. People tell on themselves if you listen closely enough." Their conversation, though brief, highlighted Miss Marple's ability to discern truth from the tangled web of human emotions and motives. Later, Charles visited Margaret in custody. Their conversation was fraught with tension, each word laden with bitterness and regret. "You destroyed us," Charles accused, his voice harsh with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Margaret, weary and resigned, responded quietly, "I did what you didn't have the courage to do. Protect what's ours." Inspector Harrow, witnessing the exchange, offered a solemn warning to Charles. "Consider yourself fortunate, Mr. Whittaker. Your greed and pride nearly cost you everything." The news of Charles's decision to leave St. Mary Mead and sell the manor spread quickly through the village. The villagers' reactions were mixed. Relief at the end of the family's troubled influence mingled with resentment for the years of secrecy and deception. As Charles prepared to depart, the manor looming large behind him, a symbol of legacy and loss, it was clear that the village would never quite be the same, and as he drove away, the echoes of the past remained, a reminder that even in the quietest places, the deepest fractures can profoundly shape lives. Whittaker Manor, once a symbol of affluence and influence in St. Mary Mead, now stood silent, its halls echoing not with voices but with the faint whispers of its past. Miss Marple, taking advantage of the invitation to visit the estate one last time before its sale, walked through the familiar rooms slowly, her steps measured, her eyes observant. As she entered the library, a place of many revelations, the scent of aged books mixed with a trace of tragedy still lingered in the air. The shelves were nearly bare now, the once proud collection packed away. She paused at the grand staircase, recalling the night Lillian confidently descended, her fate unknowingly sealed by her own ambitions and the secrets she threatened to expose. Miss Marple sighed softly. Ambition unchecked and pride too fierce. A deadly combination, she mused, her voice barely a whisper. Outside, the gardener, who was tending to the last bits of the garden before his own departure, tipped his hat to Miss Marple as she walked out. "Place won't be the same without the Whittakers, but maybe that's for the best," he remarked, a note of relief thinly veiled by his usual stoicism. Later that day, Miss Marple met with Inspector Harrow at the village inn, a quaint establishment favoured by locals for its warm scones and stronger tea. They sat at their usual table by the window, the autumn light casting a warm glow over the polished wood. Over tea they discussed the remnants of the case. "Beatrice has left town," Harrow reported. Daniel has inherited a small portion of Lillian's estate, enough to start anew, and Harold, he faces sentencing for theft but not murder. It's a tidy ending, though not a happy one, Harrow noted, stirring his tea thoughtfully. Miss Marple nodded, her expression contemplative. Justice isn't always joyful, Inspector, but it must be just, she replied, her gaze drifting to the villagers outside, going about their daily lives oblivious to the undercurrents that had just shifted beneath their feet. The following morning Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Daniel Everett, looking slightly more at ease than he had in weeks, came to express his gratitude. Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you, he began, his voice steady. Lillian wasn't perfect, but she deserved better than lies and greed. He shared his plans to leave St. Mary Mead, his inheritance providing a means to escape the shadows that lingered in the village. Too many ghosts here, he confessed, a distant look in his eyes. Miss Marple offered him a gentle smile as he prepared to depart. We all carry ghosts, Mr. Everett. The question is how we live with them, she remarked, watching him walk down the path that led away from her cottage. As Daniel disappeared from view, Miss Marple turned back to her home, her mind heavy with thoughts on the complexities of family, ambition, and the quiet, often unseen forces that shape our lives. St. Mary Mead, for all its quaint charm, would continue to harbour these stories, waiting for someone to uncover them, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, would be there to piece together the puzzles left behind. As the weeks slid into one another with the gentle surety of changing seasons, St. Mary Mead began to find its rhythm once more. The market square, always a barometer of the village's heartbeat, buzzed with the mundane yet comforting discussions of crop yields, the anticipation of the upcoming harvest festival, and the ever-changing English weather. On a crisp Sunday morning, the village church, with its ancient stone and serene ambience, welcomed its congregation. Reverend Granger, standing before his flock, his voice echoing slightly off the old stone walls, delivered a sermon that resonated with the undercurrents of recent upheavals. His theme of forgiveness and the dangers of unchecked pride seemed particularly poignant, drawing quiet nods and thoughtful looks from his listeners. Miss Marple, seated near the back under the stained glass depiction of St. Jude, watched the congregation with her usual keen eye. She noted the absence of Charles, who had quietly sold the manor to a young family looking to make their mark in the countryside, a fresh start, much like the seeds soon to be planted for the next season's growth. Later that afternoon, in the comfortable confines of her own cottage, Miss Marple hosted afternoon tea for Mrs. Hartnell and Reverend Granger. As they enjoyed the warm scones and strong tea, the conversation inevitably turned to the Whittaker family and their dramatic departure from village life. It's odd how quickly things return to normal, Mrs. Hartnell remarked, stirring her tea a bit more vigorously than necessary. Miss Marple, adding a spoonful of sugar to her own cup, responded thoughtfully. Normal, yes, but never quite the same. Scandals fade, but memories linger. She glanced towards her knitting basket, where her latest project lay alongside her tools, each yarn and needle an essential part of the whole, much like the threads of the story she had helped unravel. Reverend Granger nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of relief and residual concern. The human heart is resilient, he mused, yet it bears the marks of every trial. In the following weeks, Miss Marple received correspondence from those touched by the scandal. Beatrice, now residing in London, wrote of her new life working in a quaint bookshop. "I've found work in a bookshop. A simpler life suits me," she penned. Her words conveyed a sense of peace, a stark contrast to her previous turmoil. Daniel, too, sent a postcard from the coast, where he had retreated to distance himself from the whispers that so often followed wealth, however new-found. "The sea is constant and soothing," he wrote, his script unsteady but honest. "A quiet existence far from past shadows. As for Margaret, her sentencing passed with little fanfare, a brief note in the local papers and some subdued discussion at the pub. It served as a cautionary tale, a sombre reminder of where unchecked emotions and hidden fears could lead. St. Mary Mead, with its rolling fields and quaint cottages, slowly turned the page on this chapter of its history. Life moved on, as it invariably does, but with the wisdom that beneath the calm surface, complexities of the human soul still churned, waiting for the patient and observant eye to understand, and, when necessary, to untangle. The quiet streets of St. Mary Mead, so often a backdrop for quaint rural life, today reflected a poignant shift as Inspector Harrow prepared for his departure. The weight of the recent scandal had cast a long shadow over his career, one that, despite his best efforts, couldn't be escaped in the confines of a small village. In the late afternoon, Harrow made his way to Miss Marple's cottage, a place that had become a sort of sanctuary during the turbulence of his investigations. The garden was lush with the onset of summer, and he found Miss Marple tending to her roses, her movements deliberate and gentle. "You have a gift, Miss Marple, and a patience I lack," Harrow remarked as he approached, his tone a mix of admiration and resignation. Miss Marple, looking up from her flowers, offered a soft smile. "Experience teaches patience, Inspector, and people, well, they're wonderfully predictable, given time." Their conversation meandered through the events that had shaken St. Mary Mead, each reflecting on the roles they had played. As Harrow prepared to leave, Miss Marple walked with him to his car, her steps steady and sure. As he climbed into his car, Harrow paused, looking back at the elderly detective with a newfound respect. "Mr. Mary Mead won't be the same without your guidance," he admitted. Miss Marple watched him drive away, her eyes thoughtful. The burden of truth was often a heavy one, and justice, while necessary, carried its own costs. As the car disappeared round the bend, she turned back to her garden, the scent of roses heavy in the air. Later, as the day drew to a close, Miss Marple decided to take a leisurely walk through the village. The streets bustled with the usual activity. Children laughing as they darted around the market square, shopkeepers chatting with customers, the mundane yet comforting rhythm of daily life resuming its pace. She made her way past the now renovated Whitaker Manor, where the new owners, a young family with bright hopes for their future, were busy planting a garden. Notably absent were any foxgloves, the family opting instead for a variety of less ominous flowers. Miss Marple paused to watch them for a moment, their laughter and light-hearted banter a stark contrast to the manor's recent past. A soft breeze stirred the leaves around her, and she smiled gently. "New beginnings where old endings lie," she murmured to herself. The phrase felt fitting, not just for the family starting anew, but for the village itself, healing from the wounds of its hidden secrets. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The cycles of life, with its trials and triumphs, would go on, and she would be there, quiet sentinel, ever watchful, ever ready to unravel whatever mysteries came her way. St. Mary Mead, with all its quaint charm and hidden depths, was home, and she cherished every part of it, its past, its present, and its unwritten future. The day's light faded into the soft glow of evening as Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair by the fire in her cosy cottage. The room was filled with the comforting sounds of a wood fire crackling and knitting needles clicking together rhythmically. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead was quieting down, with only the occasional bark of a distant dog or the whisper of the wind in the trees. In her lap, a new knitting project was slowly taking shape, each stitch a methodical and soothing motion. At her feet, Tibbles, her steadfast feline companion, lay curled into a contented ball, occasionally opening one eye to ensure all was as it should be. Miss Marple sipped her tea, a fine blend that steamed gently against the coolness of the evening. Her mind wandered through the events of recent weeks, the lies uncovered, the truths painfully extracted, and the undeniable proof of human complexity and frailty. It had been a taxing time, revealing the layers of deceit woven into the very fabric of St. Mary Mead. The soft knock at the door came just as Miss Marple was pouring herself another cup of tea. Mrs. Hartnell entered, bearing a plate of freshly baked scones, her face alight with the simple joy of sharing. "St. Mary Mead quiet again, until the next scandal," Mrs. Hartnell chuckled, as she set the scones down on the small table next to Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled, accepting the offering with a nod of thanks. "Oh, I do hope not, Mrs. Hartnell. One murder is quite enough for a season," she replied with a gentle humour that belied the seriousness of their recent turmoil. They settled into a comfortable silence, the kind shared by old friends who understand that not every silence needs filling. The weight of recent events seemed to lift a little, floating away with the smoke from the fire. Later, as Mrs. Hartnell departed with promises to return soon, Miss Marple was left alone once more. She gazed out the window at the night sky where stars twinkled like countless eyes watching over the world. In every heart lies darkness, but also the capacity for light. It's the choices we make that define us, Miss Marple mused aloud, her voice a soft echo in the quiet room. This thought, a reflection of her many years observing human nature, was a reminder of the dualities everyone carried within them. She sipped her tea again, feeling the warmth spread through her. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead slept peacefully, its inhabitants unaware of the silent vigil she kept. For now all was calm, but Miss Marple knew that the tranquillity was temporary. Human nature was too rich a tapestry of emotions and motives to remain quiet for long. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, Miss Marple placed her cup down, pulling her shawl closer around her shoulders. The night was deepening, and the world outside was vast and mysterious, but here in her cottage there was peace, at least for now.